Bourbon is supposed to be America's comfort whiskey. Sweet corn, warm oak, caramel, maybe a little vanilla drifting through the glass like a porch swing on a Kentucky evening. But every now and then, you pour a bottle that makes you stop mid-sip and ask a dangerous question. Who approved this? Today, we're counting down 7 bourbons that seriously disappointed me. Some are cheap and rough, some cost real money and somehow deliver less flavor than the label promises. This is a countdown from mildly regrettable to genuinely confusing. And if your favorite shows up, just remember, taste is personal. Let's start with a bottle that proves cheap whiskey and bad whiskey are not always the same thing, but sometimes they definitely are. 7. Kentucky Gentleman Bourbon Whiskey. The first time I saw Kentucky Gentleman on a shelf, it came in a bottle large enough to double as a household cleaning product. That alone should have prepared me for what was coming. But curiosity is a powerful force in the whiskey world. The label promises Kentucky heritage and traditional bourbon character, which sounds respectable enough until the cork, or more accurately, the plastic cap, comes off. What greets you is a nose that's surprisingly sharp for something bottled at just 80 proof. The aroma leans heavily towards sweet corn and light caramel, but there's a thin solvent-like edge hovering behind it that feels more laboratory than rickhouse. Give it a swirl and you'll catch hints of grain cereal and faint vanilla, the kind of note that suggests the bourbon wants to be pleasant, but never quite gets there. It's not offensive right away. Instead, it feels unfinished, like a sketch of bourbon rather than a finished painting. The first sip confirms that suspicion almost immediately. The texture is extremely light, almost watery, and the flavor opens with sugary corn sweetness before fading faster than you expect. A faint caramel note appears briefly, followed by a flash of alcohol heat that feels strangely out of place considering the modest proof. It's the sort of whiskey that seems to disappear mid-palate, leaving you wondering whether your taste buds miss something important. That curiosity led to what I call the second glass test, the moment where a bourbon either redeems itself or digs its own grave. With Kentucky Gentleman, the second pour doesn't transform the experience. Instead, the alcohol edge becomes more noticeable while the flavor still struggles to develop any real depth. The sweetness remains simple and one-dimensional, like corn syrup trying to impersonate caramel. To be fair, Kentucky Gentleman isn't pretending to compete with premium bourbons. It lives in the ultra-budget world where price and availability matter far more than complexity. That explains why it often appears at big parties, mixed drinks, and anywhere whiskey is being poured into cola, rather than a Glencairn glass. But in a tasting focused purely on flavor, this bottle lands near the bottom. It isn't catastrophically bad, yet it offers almost nothing memorable either. Kentucky Gentleman ends up feeling like bourbon's version of background music. Present, technically functional, but never something you'd choose when the spotlight is on the whiskey itself. 6. Old Crow Kentucky Straight Bourbon. Old Crow carries a name that sounds like it should come with dusty saloons, poker tables, and stories about riverboat gamblers. Historically, the brand actually did enjoy serious respect in the 19th century, when Dr. James Crow helped pioneer sour mash whiskey production. That heritage gives the bottle a certain romantic weight, the kind that makes you expect a sip of history when you pour it. The reality today is a little less dramatic. Pour Old Crow into a glass, and the nose opens with classic bourbon markers: light vanilla, toasted grain, and a faint caramel sweetness. There's also a citrusy note hiding underneath that keeps the aroma from feeling completely flat. At first sniff, it almost convinces you that this might be one of those underrated bottom-shelf surprises. Then the sip arrives and the illusion starts to wobble. The opening flavor brings mild vanilla and a touch of caramel sweetness, but the body feels extremely thin. Instead of expanding across the palate, the whiskey moves quickly and leaves behind a slightly grainy edge that reminds you this is a budget pour. The alcohol warmth shows up early and lingers longer than the flavor itself. What's interesting about Old Crow is that it never completely collapses the way some cheap bourbons do. The flavor remains reasonably balanced: corn sweetness, a hint of oak, and mild spice. But everything feels dialed down. It's like listening to a band where every instrument is playing at half volume. Nothing is technically wrong, yet nothing stands out either. That's why the second glass test becomes important here. Sometimes a modest bourbon grows on you after a few minutes of breathing in the glass. With Old Crow, the second pour smooths the edges slightly and brings out a bit more caramel character, but the overall structure stays the same. The body remains light, the finish short, and the complexity minimal. To understand Old Crow, you have to think about its purpose. This is a bourbon designed for accessibility, easy to find, inexpensive, and uncomplicated enough to mix into cocktails without hesitation. In that role, it performs adequately. Pour it into an old-fashioned or a whiskey sour, and it quietly does its job. But judged strictly as a sipping bourbon, Old Crow struggles to rise above the middle of the budget shelf. The historical name promises character, yet the modern liquid rarely delivers anything beyond basic bourbon notes. That disconnect between reputation and experience is exactly why Old Crow lands near the bottom of this countdown. If you're enjoying the countdown so far, hit like and subscribe for more brutally honest whiskey rankings. It helps the channel grow. And it lets me know I'm not the only one out here sacrificing my taste buds for bourbon research. Number 5. Kentucky Tavern. Kentucky Straight Bourbon. Kentucky Tavern is one of those bottles that sounds far more romantic than the experience it delivers. The name paints a picture of dark wood bars, brass rails, and a bartender polishing glasses while someone plays blues in the corner. Instead, the reality usually involves a plastic pour spout and a shelf where price tags matter more than tasting notes. It's a whiskey that exists quietly in the background of the bourbon world, rarely celebrated, but rarely disappearing either. The nose actually starts off with some promise. There's a gentle sweetness that hints at caramel corn and vanilla wafer cookies, with a light oak note drifting in behind it. For a moment, it feels like this might be one of those sleeper bourbons that overperforms its humble price. The aroma is soft rather than aggressive, and it suggests a friendly, easygoing pour. The first sip, however, quickly explains where Kentucky Tavern belongs in this ranking. The opening sweetness arrives fast. Corn syrup and faint caramel, but the structure underneath feels loose and thin. Instead of developing into layers of flavor, the bourbon moves quickly across the tongue and fades before it can build momentum. A whisper of oak appears near the end, but it feels more like an afterthought than a defining feature. Pouring a second glass doesn't dramatically change the story. What becomes clearer is that Kentucky Tavern was never meant to compete with complex sipping bourbons in the first place. The profile is simple, almost deliberately so, designed to blend smoothly into cocktails where citrus, sugar, or soda will do most of the heavy lifting. In that context, the bourbon actually makes sense. Drop it into a whiskey sour, or mix it with cola, and it becomes serviceable, even pleasant in a casual setting. But on its own, Kentucky Tavern lacks the depth and texture that make a bourbon memorable. It doesn't collapse into disaster, yet it never manages to stand up and introduce itself either. Number 4. Basil Hayden Kentucky Straight Bourbon. At first glance, Basil Hayden feels like it should be sitting much higher on this list. The tall bottle looks elegant, the label carries historical references, and the price suggests you're stepping into respectable bourbon territory. It's one of those bottles people often reach for when they want to look knowledgeable about whiskey without diving fully into enthusiast territory. The aroma is where Basil Hayden begins to show its personality. There's a delicate spice floating above the glass, something slightly herbal with hints of pepper and tea leaves. Underneath that sits a mild sweetness, light honey, a touch of caramel, maybe a suggestion of toasted grain. It's an inviting nose, gentle rather than aggressive, which makes the bourbon seem approachable even before the first sip. That sip, though, is where the experience becomes complicated. Basil Hayden is bottled at 80 proof, which gives it a very soft delivery. The initial flavor carries a mild sweetness and a flicker of spice, but the body feels surprisingly thin for something positioned as a premium bourbon. Instead of spreading warmth and depth across the palate, the whiskey glides through quickly, leaving only faint echoes of flavor behind. Trying a second pour doesn't suddenly unlock hidden complexity either. What becomes clear is that Basil Hayden is designed to be extremely easy to drink, almost to the point of being whisper quiet. For newcomers to bourbon, that subtlety can feel welcoming. For experienced drinkers expecting richness and weight, it can feel like something is missing. That tension between presentation and substance is what places Basil Hayden in the lower half of this countdown. The bourbon isn't unpleasant, and it certainly isn't flawed. But when the bottle promises bold character and the glass delivers polite restraint, the result can feel less like a satisfying pour and more like an expensive introduction. Number 3. Jefferson's Ocean Aged at Sea Bourbon. Jefferson's Ocean might have the most dramatic backstory in modern bourbon marketing. The idea is undeniably fascinating. Barrels loaded onto ships, traveling across oceans, while waves rock them back and forth, exposing the whiskey to changing climates and salty air. It sounds less like distilling and more like a whiskey adventure film. When you pour it into the glass, the nose immediately feels different from typical bourbon profiles. There's still caramel and vanilla present, but a subtle briny edge sometimes appears around the edges of the aroma. It's not exactly salt water, yet there's a maritime note that makes you pause for a moment and wonder if the voyage really did leave its mark. The first sip can be intriguing for the same reason. The sweetness arrives first: brown sugar, vanilla, a little toasted oak, before a faint mineral or salty tone drifts through the finish. In theory, that uniqueness should make the whiskey exciting. In practice, the flavors sometimes feel slightly disjointed, as though two different personalities are sharing the same glass. A second pour often amplifies that impression. The sweetness remains pleasant enough, but the overall profile doesn't quite settle into harmony. Some batches feel richer than others, and that variability becomes noticeable when you taste multiple releases. The concept behind Jefferson's Ocean is bold and creative, yet the execution doesn't always translate into a consistently satisfying sip. That's what ultimately places it this high on the list. Jefferson's Ocean isn't a terrible bourbon by any stretch. It's drinkable, occasionally interesting, and undeniably memorable. But when a bottle leans heavily on its story, the whiskey inside has to carry equal weight. In this case, the voyage is often more impressive than the destination in the glass. Number 2. Willet Pot Still Reserve Bourbon. Few bottles in the bourbon world attract attention the way Willet Pot Still Reserve does. The decanter is shaped like a traditional copper pot still, and on a crowded shelf, it looks almost like a museum piece. People notice it instantly, which means this bourbon often ends up being purchased for the visual appeal before anyone has even tasted what's inside. That striking design creates a powerful first impression long before the whiskey reaches the glass. The aroma actually begins with a respectable introduction. Soft vanilla drifts upward along with light fruit notes that resemble baked apple or pear. A gentle layer of oak sits underneath, suggesting that the bourbon might develop into something deeper after a few minutes in the glass. It's the kind of nose that makes you hopeful that the whiskey will match the dramatic presentation of the bottle. The first sip, however, tends to feel lighter than expected. There's sweetness right away, vanilla, caramel, and a touch of fruit, but the texture doesn't carry much weight. Instead of expanding across the palate, the flavor moves quickly, leaving only a modest trace of oak and mild spice behind. Nothing is particularly offensive, yet nothing rises to grab your attention either. Pouring another glass doesn't unlock hidden layers the way some bourbons do. What becomes clearer is that Willet Pot Still Reserve offers a gentle, almost delicate profile. That subtlety can appeal to drinkers who prefer mild whiskey, but for others it creates a mismatch between the bold presentation of the bottle and the quiet personality of the liquid. In the end, this bourbon lands near the top of the countdown because of that contrast. The bottle promises something extraordinary, yet the experience inside the glass feels far more ordinary. It's not an unpleasant whiskey, but it's a reminder that striking packaging and memorable flavor aren't always the same thing. Number 1. Hudson Baby Bourbon. Hudson Baby Bourbon has long carried a reputation that sparks strong reactions among whiskey drinkers. Produced in New York and made entirely from corn, it represents one of the earlier attempts to bring craft distilling into the bourbon conversation. On paper, that concept sounds exciting. Small-scale production, unconventional aging methods, and a whiskey that stands apart from the traditional Kentucky landscape. The aroma immediately tells you this bourbon isn't following the usual script. Sweet corn dominates the nose in a very direct way, almost like opening a bag of fresh kettle corn at a fairground. There's also a heavy layer of toasted wood hovering nearby, a sign of the very small barrels used during aging. Those barrels accelerate the interaction between whiskey and oak, which can dramatically change the flavor in a short period of time. That intense wood influence becomes impossible to ignore once the bourbon reaches your palate. The opening sweetness arrives quickly, but it's followed almost immediately by an aggressive wave of oak and tannin. Instead of feeling mature and rounded, the whiskey can come across as if it aged too fast and picked up more wood than balance. The result is a sip that feels sharp, heavy, and strangely uneven. A second pour confirms the pattern rather than softening it. The sweetness remains bright, yet the oak continues to dominate the experience, leaving a bitter edge on the finish that lingers longer than most drinkers expect. It's the sort of flavor profile that sparks debate. Some people admire the boldness, while others struggle to get through a single glass. That extreme character is what ultimately places Hudson Baby Bourbon at the top of this list. The bottle represents creativity and ambition within the craft whiskey movement, but the execution doesn't always deliver the harmony that bourbon lovers look for. In this countdown, it earns the #1 spot not because it lacks personality, but because that personality can overwhelm everything else in the glass. So that's my list of the 7 worst bourbons I've tried, from mildly disappointing to truly confusing pours. Did your favorite survive the cut? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy brutally honest whiskey rankings, like the video and subscribe for more.